Hello, and thanks for joining me. Today I want to do a quick chat about a little treasure of a book that I just finished called "The Poetics of Space" by Gaston Bachelard. I came across this book just browsing for books a couple of months ago when I was putting together my 2017 TBR, and this one really stuck out at me as something that I might be interested in. It is apparently it has a long history of inspiring different types of people like architects, um, writers, poets, really artists of lots of different types, because this is a study of space, like houses and rooms, and the poetics of that, meaning how that these sort of spaces are used in poetry and in literature to, transform us, to transform our consciousness. And so, I thought it sounded really interesting. I thought it might be challenging, but I wanted to go ahead and give it a try. And I'm really glad that I did because it wound up being, extremely readable. For me, who's not a philosopher or a poet. So it was very readable to me, very engaging. A little bit of history on the work. Gaston Bachelard was a French philosopher, and this work actually came out originally in France in 1958. This particular translation that I read in English is by Maria Jolas, and it was published in the U.S. in 1964. This particular edition, this is an updated edition from 2014 of that translation. This particular edition from 2014 has an introduction by Mark Danielewski, who wrote House of Leaves, which I haven't read, but which I've always kind of meant to read. But that's sort of the history of this version that I read. But what the book is about is the poetics of space. So it's about a sort of a study of spaces like houses and rooms and different sorts of dwellings like that. Also things inside rooms like chests, wardrobes, drawers, and how that poets and writers of literature can use this sort of reference points to really transport our consciousness into a word called oniric. Which is a dreamlike state, which is basically poetry, and so he gives throughout the course of the book, he actually uses examples from poetry and from literature where the different authors and writers have used these sort of images that then transport that transport our being and transport our consciousness. So just to go through the chapters, the first chapter is called The House, From Cellar to Garret and the Significance of the Hut. Chapter 2 is called House and Universe. Chapter 3 is called Drawers, Chests, and Wardrobes. Chapter 4 is called Nests, which is another type of house. 5 is Shells, which is another type of house. 6 is Corners, which I loved this chapter. 7 is Miniature. Another thing that I really loved was exploring that idea of the world as miniature, followed by then Intimate Immensity, which was also cool. Chapter 9 was the Dialectics of Outside and Inside, and then 10 is the Phenomenology of Roundness. So, so cool. There is a quote that from Gaston Bachelard from the introduction that I thought sort of described the work really well, so I'll just read the quote real quick. It says, "Our soul is an abode, and by remembering houses and rooms, we learn to abide within ourselves. Now my aim is clear. I must show that the house is one of the greatest powers of integration for the thoughts, memories, and dreams of mankind." And the work is just filled, each of these chapters is just filled with all sorts of examples taken from poetry and from literature that really just, transport us, poetically, poetry, as opposed to metaphor and as opposed to psychology. It's that moment when you hit a phrase in a work of fiction or in a poem that really just shifts your consciousness into a different realm. And this realm he calls an oneric, which is a dreamlike state. I had to look that word up. Actually, this work, it is a work technically of philosophy, and I read this electronically, so it was really nice to have my handy dictionary for the few philosophical terms in there that I needed to remind myself what they meant. I've heard some of them before, but some of them were brand new, like this word honoric was completely new to me. But like I said, the book is extremely readable. So for a person who's not a philosopher like me, so don't be put off by big philosophical words. There's only a few of them that a handy dictionary can quickly make clear for anyone, any reader. Things I took away from it is, one of the writers that he mentions very frequently in this work is Henri Bosco, and he actually mentions several of Henri Bosco's works. One of them is called Hyacinth, and Gaston Bachelard actually says Hyacinth constitutes one of the most astounding psychological novels of our time. Now, granted, this is from 1958. I looked up Henri Bosco. I couldn't find any of his works in English in sort of the quick searches that I did. I only saw even one work still in French, so I'm wondering if all of his works were now out of print, and if so, that's really sad, because I would really love to explore some of the works that of Henri Bosco that were mentioned in this work. And then there was this example from Immensity, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how he had the ability, what he's talking about with these images, how like images from literature or from poetry have the ability to transport our consciousness. There is an example he gives in the chapter of Immensity that is from Walden by Thoreau that I thought was a really good quick example that I could read to you, and it would really sort of show what I'm talking about here. And the quote is this: "A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is Earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature." So, a lake as the Earth's eye, then gazing into the universe, that is what, in the example of Immensity, that's what he's talking about here, where these few little short words, transport us into this immensity. And then there's, each of these chapters have examples, like the miniatures, another one, where selected lines and excerpts from literature, take us into the miniature, but by taking us into the miniature, take us into a completely different space. So it's just real cool. I related it to several examples. The chapter on Immensity actually fit really well with, the previous book chat I did on A Little Larger Than the Entire Universe, which was the selected poems by Fernando Pessoa that I just finished reading and did the book chat on. My Heart is a Little Larger Than the Entire Universe is that's a poetic example of immensity, which is taking something small like the heart, but it's a little larger than the entire universe. So, it expands then to something huge. That's just, to me, that was just extremely kind of cool. And the work was just, like I said, completely filled with these kind of images that were just such a delight to read. There was a Carl Jung quote that I thought was real cool. In the introduction, he talks about Carl Jung, the psychologist, psychology sort of, sort of the philosophy of psychology, Carl Jung. And there was a description from Carl Jung that I thought really related to Dead City of the Dead Boys. If you saw the video chat that I did on the book Dead Boys, it really, the way that the author of Dead Boys, Gabriel Scalia, described Dead City fits exactly with this quote for Carl Jung. So I'll just read that quote real quick too. The quote is this: "We have to describe and to explain a building, the upper story of which was erected in the 19th century, the ground floor dates from the 16th century, and a careful examination of the masonry discloses the fact that it was reconstructed from a dwelling tower of the 11th century. In the cellar we discover Roman foundation walls, and under the cellar a filled-in cave, in the floor of which stone tools are found and remnants of glacial fauna and the layers below. That would be a sort of picture of our mental structure. And, Gabriel Squaley in the book Dead Boys describes Dead City as this jumble of architecture and buildings from every age known to humans. And periodically, the river Lethe in the underworld floods and rearranges these buildings in a jumble. And so I wonder now, reading it, if there was more psychological going on in the fantasy book Dead Boys than I had realized at the time, because that description of Dead City is dead on with actually what Carl Jung said about human consciousness. So I thought that was cool too. Then finally, to relate to another book that I read really recently that you might have seen the video to, All Things Shining, which was this work about, the works of Western civilization and how the authors there were really trying to point out that literature can be used to, whoosh us up into something bigger than ourselves and to transport ourselves to something outside of ourselves, sort of finding the sacred in the everyday. And, I think that this work really expressed that as well, because what Gaston Bachelard here is actually doing is whooshing us up. We're reading along in a book or in a novel or in a poem, and all of a sudden we're whooshed up into a different state of being, a dreamlike state that we weren't in before. And so I thought that was really a good example of that whooshing up and changing, getting caught up in something, bigger than yourself through the action of reading. So, I'm really glad that I did decide to put this work on my TBR for 2017. I do hope this stays in print for a long time. It's a treasure, this voice coming at us from the middle of the 20th century that's still sort of a guidepost on, giving us a guide to, how to live a good life. And one of those ways is to, transport ourselves into other states of being. And we can do that through reading and literature. So I thought that was cool. I'll leave it at that. I will have more chats and etc. coming up in the very near future. So until then, take care.